begin the recording. If I can ask everyone to please mute yourself. You are able to unmute yourself. And feel free to do so to ask a question. But until you feel compelled to ask a question, please keep your microphone muted. And I greatly appreciate all of your accommodation. Here she is, Mrs. Gluck. Okay, everyone. Yeah, we have quite a number of people online. We have quite a number of people here in person. Let's get the show on the road. Okay. So, all right, that's more people are still coming in. All right, just for the record, we have 15 people online, and we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 people here in person. Let's get going. So as you can see in front of you, on the very top of the page, it says 8 ideas for the 8 nights of Hanukkah, and they only some of them have a particular order. Let's talk about the first night of Hanukkah. What's the date for the first night of Hanukkah? It's on the paper in front of you. You can cheat. It is the 25th of Kislev, right? So what's that? It's always the 25th of Kislev. That is correct. So in order to discuss the 25th of Kislev, let's ask a question. What is the accoutrement of the temple that is most closely or most seriously associated with Chanukah? The menorah, right? That's what you would assume. That's what you would think, because that's all we ever really talk about. We discuss the miracle of the oil. But if you were to take a look at for example, the piyot that we recite as we light the menorah, ma'os tzur, what is the accoutrement that seems to get the most focus there?
Salvation, redemption.
Well, no, the ma'os or Yeshua's, right? But it talks about the mizbeach. It talks about the altar. Likewise, also Kriyas HaTorah for the entirety of Hanukkah. What does it talk about? It doesn't talk about the menorah. What does it talk about? It talks about the altar. It talks about the mizbeach. So in the entire Kriya, the laning that we make over the entirety of Hanukkah, as well as much of the poetry and the prayers that we say, they discuss quite a bit about the altar. The menorah does not seem to get as much press. So the question that we have to ask is, why is it that we seem to be giving so much importance to the Mizbeach? Why are we giving so much importance to the altar? So in order to answer this question, which will come back to the 25th of Kislev, let's actually take a look at the Book of Maccabees. Now, the Book of Maccabees is one of those esoteric texts. It's one of the Sefarim HaChitzonim. It's one of those non-canonized books from the biblical era. I guess you can call it the biblical era, but it's not exactly. But it's that post-biblical era. But it's given a lot of importance within Jewish history, but it's still not a portion of Tanakh. But it actually dates. It's almost contemporaneous with the events that they describe. So we have something that's a pre-Mishnaic book or work that was written in that period between the when Tanakh had officially concluded and the rabbis had taken over their role as leadership and started writing rabbinic writings like the Mishnah and so on and so forth. So let's take a look at what the Book of the Maccabees writes. Because again, the Book of the Maccabees is a book. It's a historical text, or at least as close as you can get at that time. It was an era before history actually existed. So let's take a look. Source number 1. And here we have Book 1, Chapter 1, verse 21. It says, and after Antiochus had ravaged Egypt in the 143rd year, he returned and went up against Israel. So what's playing out over here is a historical event. After Alexander's empire had fractured into 3 separate empires, you had the Seleucid Greeks who occupied Syria going to battle against the Ptolemaic Greeks who lived in Egypt. Israel was originally part of Ptolemaic Greece. It ultimately was lost to the Seleucids in a war. And here we have a description of that war that's playing out about 143 years after Alexander had conquered that region. The Seleucid Greeks go to war against the Egyptian Greeks and ultimately conquer Israel in the process. This took place before the story of Chanukah, but on his way back from fighting a victorious battle against Egypt, Antiochus goes up against Israel as well. He went up into Jerusalem and took a great multitude. He with a great multitude, a lot of soldiers, he proudly entered the sanctuary and took away the golden altar, the candlestick of light, that's the menorah, and all the vessels thereof, and the table of proposition, which is the shulchan, which the showbreads were offered on, the pouring vessels, the vials, the little mortars of gold, and the vial and the crowns and the golden ornaments that was before the temple. And he broke them into pieces. He took the silver and gold and the precious metals, and he took the hidden treasures which he found. And then he took them all away to his own country, and he made a great slaughter of men. So here we have a description of Antiochus beginning his program of persecution against the Jewish people. He starts with the temple, but then about a year or two later, 2 years later exactly, he now starts an actual campaign against Judaism itself. Here he's fighting against the Jewish people. He takes away all the wealth of the temple. Now he starts making legislation against the monotheism that was observed by the Jewish people, as well as making edicts against the observance of mitzvahs. And that's where we continue here with the next source. On the 15th, what does it say over here? On the 15th day of the month of Kislev, in the 145th year, King Antiochus set up an abominable idol of desolation upon the altar of God, and on the 25th day of the month, they sacrificed upon the altar, the altar of that idol that was over and against God. So what do we see here? We see here that on the 25th of Kislev, the Mizbeach, the altar, is defiled by Antiochus, and he begins offering sacrifices. So they do the construction on the 15th, and the construction concludes on the 25th, and on the 25th of Kislev, they begin offering idolatrous sacrifices in the Beis Hamikdash. So you already see that there's something significant about the 25th of Kislev, and we also see that there's something associated with the altar, with the Mizbeach here as well. Why did he wait until the 25th? It might be easy to say that perhaps it was just coincidental, but we're going to see that the 25th actually plays a larger role throughout the entire story as it plays out in the book of the Maccabees. So now let's continue in source number 2 with verse 63. So we see that Antiochus now, besides for profaning the temple and using it now for idolatrous sacrifices, he now puts into effect edicts and decrees against the Jewish religion overall. The women that circumcised their children were slain according to the command of King Antiochus, and they hung the children around their necks in all their houses, and those that circumcised them they were put to death. And many people of Israel determined with themselves that they would not eat unkosher food. They would rather die than to be defiled with unkosher meat, and they would not break any of the holy laws of God, and those individuals were put to death. So we have here a story that incorporates edicts against the Jewish people. We have here a story that incorporates defilement of the Mizbeach, and we also see within the story that the 25th of Kislev is an important date for how this whole program began. We have within the language of rabbinic writings that the Jewish people rested after successfully perpetrating a rebellion against the Greeks, and the war was concluded on the 25th. But we're going to actually see from the rest of the text that the battle seems to have been won earlier, and they specifically waited until the 25th before they actually once again took over the temple and began offering sacrifices on a renewed altar. Let's take a look and see how the book of Maccabees talks about the next step in the story. So this is source number 3. And Judah said, and his brothers said, now that our enemies have been defeated, let's go to Jerusalem and purify the temple and rededicate it. So the whole army was assembled and went up to Mount Zion. Now this is 5 years later. As we said earlier, the whole program started in the year 143. This is taking place 5 years later in the year 148, since the time of Alexander's conquest of the land of Israel. So this is taking place here about 5 years after the whole thing begins. So they've been in active rebellion for at least 3 years. They found the temple abandoned and the altar profaned. The gates were burnt down, the courtyards were grown up in a forest of weeds, and the priests' rooms were torn down. In their sorrow, they tore their clothes, they cried loudly, they threw ashes on their head, and they fell face down on the ground. And when the signal was given on the trumpets or the shofar, everyone cried out to Hashem. So we have described here the Maccabees. They're returning to Jerusalem. As we're going to see in just a moment or two, the war had not concluded yet. They have successfully retaken Jerusalem, but they'll still be fighting battles for at least another 2 years. The entirety of the rebellion lasted for about 7 years. Um, but we have here is what they do within Jerusalem. It seems that they remain in Jerusalem and they renew some of the services that were observed within the temple, but don't offer sacrifices quite yet. Let's see what happens. So what do they do next? Judas ordered, this is where's the source? This is verse 41 here for those at home, at the very bottom of the page. Then Judas ordered some of his soldiers to attack the men in the fort while he purified the temple. He chose some priests who were qualified and who were devoted to the law. They purified the temple. They took the stones that had been defiled and put them in an unclean place. They weren't quite sure. What's that? Yeah. Okay. There you go. Thank you. So they had these the stones of the original altar that had now been defiled. They can't get rid of these stones because the stones were used for a sacred, holy purpose originally. Now they've been used for an idolatrous purpose, so you can't continue to use them for a sacred purpose. So what do? They're not certain. They don't know. They discussed what should be done with the altar of burnt offerings, which had been desecrated by the non-Jews, and they decided to tear it down so that it would not stand there as a monument to their shame. So they tore down the altar and put the stones in a suitable place on the temple hill, and they were there to be kept until a prophet should come and decide what to do with them. So they put them basically in cold storage until they had somebody who was qualified to tell them how to dispose of these stones appropriately. They were holy, they're they've now been desecrated. What do you do with them? They didn't know, so they put them to the side. What do they start doing immediately? Well, immediately they start offering some of the offerings, like the incense, as we're going to read in just a moment. They started offering the showbread once again. And not only that, but they also started lighting the daily kindling of the menorah. So here we have in verse 47, they took the uncut stones as the law of Moses required, and they built a new altar like the old one. They repaired the temple inside and out and dedicated its courtyards. They made new utensils for worship and brought out the menorah, the altar of the incense, and the table for the bread into the temple. They burned incense on the altar and lit the lamps on the menorah, and there was light in the temple. They placed the loaves of bread on the table and hung the curtains, and they completed all their work. So they're doing all of this, but they're not using the altar yet. Why are they not using the altar? We're going to discuss that in a moment, but they wait until the 25th of Kislev before they start using the new altar once again. So here again, you have that 25th of the month that is repeated. We have the 25th of the month in which the day that Antiochus waited to start using the altar for idolatrous purposes. Here you see that the Hashmonaim, the Maccabees, are waiting until the 25th of Kislev to start using the altar once again. And we see this here starting from on verse 52. It's right over here on the bottom of the page. The 25th day of the 9th month of the month of Kislev, in that year, it was year 148, and it was the anniversary of the day that the non-Jews had desecrated the altar. On that day, a sacrifice was offered on the new altar in accordance with the law of Moses. The new altar was dedicated and hymns were sung to the accompaniment of harps, lutes, and cymbals. All the people bowed down with their faces to the ground and worshipped and praised the Lord for giving them victory. For 8 days they celebrated the rededication of the altar. With great joy they brought burnt offerings and offered fellowship offerings and thanksgiving offerings. So here again you have that 8 days popping up again also. So why is it that they wait until the 25th? It's almost as though that there's some kind of spiritual wound that they have to rectify, that it was defiled on the 25th, and therefore they have to renew it, or they have to rectify it specifically on the 25th. Perhaps that might be the reason. Why are they celebrating 8 days is another question. So to answer why they celebrating for 8 days is probably a very, very simple reason. If you take a look at the next source, in source number 4, you actually see that there's a biblical template to celebrate the inauguration of an altar or a sanctuary for 8 days. We see this, for example, in Sefer Vayikra, where Vayhi Bayom Hashemini Kara Moshe La'Aharon U'Levano U'Leziknei Yisrael. On the 8th day of the inauguration of the Mishkan, Moshe calls to Aharon and his sons, as well as to the leaders of the Jewish people, and he says, okay, here, listen up, guys, we're going to offer special sacrifices today. So they offer their special sacrifices, Vatetze eish b'lifnei Hashem, and fire issued forth from before Hashem, Vatochal al hamizbeach, and it consumed from on top of the altar, es ha'olav, es ha'chalavim, the sacred fats, as well as the burnt offering, vayar kol ha'am vayironu vayiplu al paneim. So we see that the highlight, the crescendo, the climax of the inauguration of the Mishkan in the desert was celebrated on the 8th day of its inauguration. And we also see in the next source, also from the book of Chronicles, that King Solomon, Shlomo HaMelech, also celebrated the construction of the Beis HaMikdash for 8 days. It says there that he celebrated for 7 days. All of Israel assembled with him. On the 8th day, they had a solemn gathering, and they observed the dedication of the altar for 7 days, and then they had Sukkot, and then Shmini Atzeres was the culmination of both of those holidays. So again, you see that there's this 8-day significance to the 8th day that's significant for the use of the Mizbech, for the altar. So perhaps here, when the Maccabees are renewing the altar, they're celebrating for 8 days because that just seems to be the Jewish way. You take a look at all throughout Jewish history, we always celebrate the renewed altar on the 8th day. I know that you and I spoke a year or two ago about perhaps it was 8 days to mark their inability to properly observe Sukkot over the course of the war, and as such they were able to celebrate here for 8 days. But again, you possibly have that interplay with the two, because you see that Shlomo Melech did much the same. He celebrated Sukkot around the time that he celebrated the renewal of or in his case, the inauguration of the Mizbeach. But you definitely do see that this 8 days is significant and has greater significance, especially when we start talking about the accoutrements of the Beis HaMikdash. What about the 25th? Why is it that they chose the 25th? And for that matter, why was it that the Greeks chose the 25th as the 25th of Kislev, as the day that they decided to start worshiping idols in the temple? Take a look at the next source. This is from the prophet Haggai. It's one of the 12 minor prophets, one of the Trei Asar. Take a look at these 2 verses over here. This is a prophecy about the rebuilding of the Beis HaMikdash. When does it say that the Beis HaMikdash is going to be rebuilt? The second Beis HaMikdash? He says that today, he says, is the day before we lay the foundations. What is the day before they lay the foundations? It's the 25th, it's the 24th of Kislev, which means that the Bayesheni, the second temple, the second Beis HaMikdash, was constructed or began its construction on the 25th. So the 24th day is the day before the foundations are set, but on the 25th, that's when construction begins. So the 25th is the temple's anniversary, and it seems evident that in the Second Temple times, the 25th of Kislev was an anniversary that was marked and was observed as a day of celebration. That's why the Greeks chose it as the day to begin their pagan rites within the Beis HaMikdash, and that's also why perhaps the Maccabees also waited. If you recall, they started doing all these other temple things before the 25th, and they waited until the 25th of the month of Kislev before they started using the Mizbech, before they started using the altar. So perhaps we now have an idea, besides for the idea of the menorah lasting 8 days and it perhaps being lit for the first time in those circumstances on the 25th, that there's also a relationship to the Mizbeach, there's also a relationship to the altar, in that we celebrate altars for 8 days, and we also have an attachment to the date of the 25th of Kislev because of its history as the time when the Beis HaMikdash was rebuilt for this, the second Beis HaMikdash, and it was a day that was significant to the Greeks who wanted to uproot it, and then for the Maccabees who later came along and attempted to reestablish it. All right, so that's idea number 1 for the first day of Chanukah. That is directly related to the 25th of Kislev, which is the first day of Chanukah. Okay, the second day of Chanukah. What happens on the second day of Chanukah? We add a second candle. There is an interesting discussion in the Gemara. We have two different opinions as to how, after the, I guess, how do you mark the second day of Chanukah, or the entirety of Chanukah for that matter? If you take a look here at source number 7, this is a quote from the Gemara in Shabbos. It cites an argument between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. Beis Shammai says, Yom Rishon madlik shmona, mikan ve'elach poches v'holech. Beis Shammai is of the opinion that on the first day of Chanukah, how many candles do you light? 8. And then on the second day of Chanukah, how many do you light? 7, right? And you go down until the final day of Chanukah. However, Beis Hillel, which is the practice that we follow, he's Beis Hillel Omrim. Beis Hillel says, Yom Rishon madlik achas, on the first day you light 1 candle, mikan ve'elach, and from that point onwards, mosif v'holech. You add and you go until the final day in which you light 8 candles. So we have this incredible diametrically, two diametrically opposed ideas here as to how you light the candles. Is there any sort of meaning that we could suss out, or some nuance that we could extrapolate, perhaps some lesson that we can derive? So one of the commentators that I've seen gives the following answer. He says that fire can be both a metaphor for light, as in, a little bit of fire dispels a whole bunch of darkness, but it's also a metaphor for burning, for purging, for removing. There are two different ways that we can understand the light of Chanukah. Is the light that we all possess, is that light here to dispel the darkness, or are we supposed to destroy the negativity, destroy the evil, expunge violence and everything that's harmful? In the personal sense, are we meant to remove something that's so toxic that needs to be eradicated? So in essence, there's two different ways of viewing how we interact or interface with the world. Is our purpose here in this world to destroy what is evil, or to shine a light on what is good, a light so strong that it sort of natively or naturally dispels the evil? Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel both disagree. Beis Hillel argues that when one generates more light, you generate more goodness, and naturally hate and ugliness will fade and be forced into retreat. And each day another candle is added as we create a momentum of increasing light. But Beis Shammai views the metaphor here for the removal of what is evil and what is wrong. You have to get the fire going really, really hot in order to be able to remove that negativity, that violence, that evil, the badness in the world. You have to have the fire burning bright at the beginning, and once the evil has been expunged, you can then gradually decrease the fire, cool things down, and allow the use of the item, I suppose, once again. So you have two different ways of understanding what transpired on Chanukah. Was this a rebellion to destroy something that was bad, or was this a rebellion to establish something that is good? So Chanukah marks this tension, this battle between Hellenism and Judaism, and this was a struggle that threatened Judaism at this time. We look at this, we practice Beis Hillel's method. Perhaps this is also a message for us now, that as we encounter challenges, to sequester ourselves away and create a world for ourselves of only good is not the appropriate response. That would be Beis Hillel's interpretation. Rather, the purpose here is to be the light on the outside for the outside, to bolster our values, our principles, our faith, what things that we hold so dear and so important, that ultimately its power will overwhelm anything that confronts us. But the question is, how do we encounter our challenges? How do we face them? How do we characterize them? And how do we respond? All right. That was idea number 2, the difference between Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai. Idea number 3, dedication and rededication. Every morning we read about the dedication of the altar in the Midbar. That's our Kriyas Torah. Every single morning of Chanukah, that's what we read. we read that each tribal leader gave specific sacrifices and gifts to be used in the sanctuary, in the Mishkan, in the desert. However, one tribe is absent, and that's the tribe of Levi, which also includes the Kohanim. And we're told excuse me, we're told within the text itself that Aharon was told immediately after this, okay, you're going to start lighting the menorah. So the Chazal asked the question, what exactly is the connection here between these two themes? You have the inauguration of the Mishkan and the immediate response after that, where Aaron was told he has to light the menorah, every single day. So Rashi tells us as follows, and this is in source number 8. What does it say? Tanu Rabbana, I'm sorry, wrong source. Source number 8. Keshara Aaron Chanukah Sanasiim. When Aaron saw the inauguration, the festival that the Nasiim and all the gifts and the elaborate offerings that they brought, he grew distressed. Shelo haya imohim b'Chanukah lohu v'lo shifto. He was not associated. He was not a part of this during the time of the inauguration of the Mishkan. He was not a participant, neither he nor his tribe. So Amar Lo HaKadosh Baruch Hu, therefore Hashem said in response to this distress that Aharon felt, Chayecha, by your life, Shalacha Gedolim Shalahem. Your lot or your role is greater than their role. Why? What's your role going to be? Sha'ata Madlik Umetiv Es Haneros. Your role, your job will be to beautify and light the Neros every single day. So this begs the obvious question, does this really solve the problem? You know, the chieftains, the Nasiim, they took part in this gala event. It was a celebratory inauguration. It was a public event. It was a national event. Everyone would remember this. Aaron and his sons, by contrast, have to tend to the light of the menorah. They have to light this every day. And it's not something that is in the headlines. It's not something that shows up on cameras. They have to every morning clean off the menorah, fill it with oil. You light it. Then you light it. You light it at night, and that same thing is repeated every single day. It seems rather grueling, rather much grunt labor. What exactly is the compensation, or what exactly is the comfort that Aaron is to take in this? So I think this is exactly the point, in fact, that it's easy to attend a grand opening. It's easy to be a participant in a new institution. It's a time when everyone's excited, everything is fresh. But what happens a month later, a year later? What happens a generation later? What happens when the excitement, starts to dissipate, when enthusiasm seems to wane? You can think of Target, for an example. It was a lot of fun when it first opened up. People got pretty tired of it pretty soon. They ran out of products to sell, but I don't think too many people were too sad to see it go by the time it left. But this is the role of Aharon. His energy is not the dedication, but rededication. It's the daily grind, the daily upkeep. It's the daily rekindling, and that's Aharon's power. And perhaps that's also the message of Chanukah itself also. This is a rebellion that did not take place over the course of a week. It wasn't a month. It wasn't a year. It was many years. It was about 7 years before they were ultimately victorious, and it was 5 years before they could re-enter the temple. This was a grueling war that took a lot of time and a lot of patience. It was not won instantaneously. So they started a grueling rebellion to rekindle Judaism. They found that hidden jar of oil, the Jewish essence, and let that light grow and allow that light of rebellion to continue. And ultimately, they won the war. And perhaps it's not incidental that it was Aaron's descendants, the priests, who led this rebellion. As I indicated, it's very easy to imagine that people were greatly discouraged after just a short period of time. Not every day was a good day at war. And so perhaps also the lesson is for us that as we sit, now it gets dark rather early, that we rekindle the light, we spread the light. The real challenge is in finding enthusiasm for not necessarily what's new and fresh, but for our daily duties, like, coming to Shabbos every day, coming to, reading the Torah every week. The humdrum, the boring, the stuff that you have to do every single day. The truth is that's the dynamo of our spirituality. That's what keeps us walking sort of in check with the divine, on a divine path. The every day the drudgery of the everyday is is very, very discouraging. But perhaps that's the importance of Chanukah, the message, the implication that we have to find the energy within the everyday in order to make every day spectacular and make the even the humdrum, even the things that we do by rote more important and significant. Hanukkah is about rekindling that energy, that drive. When you first start davening for the first time, if you're a child or if you come to observance later in life, the Siddur is exciting, Shabbos is exciting, everything's fantastic. I think it's actually pretty boring after a while. It's what you do every single day. The idea is that we have to sort of find that excitement and rekindle that enthusiasm. And that's the message of Hanukkah. That's the message of Aharon and the rekindling of the menorah on a daily basis. Okay, message number 4, lesson number 4, a new light. So in source number 9, you have a fascinating discussion in the Gemara, Iboyaluhu hadlaka osa mitzvah, o hanacha osa mitzvah. Questions like this. Let's imagine for a moment that I lit the menorah in a place that I don't fulfill the mitzvah. Let's say I light it. I don't know. I light it indoors. Now we all light it indoors now, but let's imagine that we're living in Israel. I'm lighting it in a non-appropriate place. Or you know what? Here, this is a good example. If your menorah is more than 20 amos high, which is about 40 feet off the ground, if you light it that high, you don't fulfill the mitzvah. It has to be within 40 feet of the ground. Otherwise, you have to figure out another way to do it. You're lighting up for the people on the inside, not on the outside. But what happens if I light the menorah? It's too high up. I pick it up and I bring it downstairs and put it down so that now it's at the prerequisite height for the menorah. Have I fulfilled the mitzvah? And the answer is no. That's what the Gemara is asking over here. Is it the lighting that's important, or is it the placement that's important? And the Gemara answers, no, it's the placement that's important. It's the lighting that's important. You have to light it in the place where the mitzvah will be fulfilled. There's some interesting knock-on halachas about this. Let's imagine for a moment I light the menorah, and then your 3-year-old runs through the room and blows out all the candles. Do you have to light them again? Yeah, you probably should. Do you make the bracha again? No. Why don't you make the bracha again? Well, because you already fulfilled the mitzvah. And even if you don't relight them, the mitzvah was fulfilled because at the time that you lit them, they were in the right place and they had the prerequisite amount of fuel to last the prerequisite amount of time. You fulfilled the mitzvah at the time of lighting. They don't necessarily have to stay lit for that extent of time. If they go out, you obviously don't want to put them out yourself, but if they go out, you have fulfilled the mitzvah. It's the lighting that's the important. It's not really what follows afterwards. So let's sort of further this analogy, what we said a moment ago. What exactly is the key to the mitzvah of Chanukah? It's to kindle new light. Chanukah reminds us that we have to recreate, we have to increase. It's not enough to relocate what was old. We have to kindle something that is new. There's this idea that, we only have a certain amount, a finite amount of, let's say, energy or time within a day. It's not so much when it comes to how we conceptualize Judaism. It's not that we can sort of remove time from A and place it for task B. It shouldn't work that way within Yiddishkeit. If we shouldn't take enthusiasm for mitzvah A and now apply it to mitzvah B. Mitzvah A requires its enthusiasm and mitzvah B requires it as well. The mission of Chanukah is to generate new light, new Torah, and in an effort to recreate ourselves. Okay, now Chanukah and Jewish power. This is idea number 5 for the 5th day of Chanukah. So let me ask you a question. What are we celebrating on Chanukah? Are we celebrating the Jewish spirit that can't be beaten down, that despite exile, we still light our menorahs and we still profess the belief in the Torah and think about the return of the Beis HaMikdash? Are we celebrating the miracle of Chanukah, or are we celebrating the sovereignty that was achieved by the Jewish people at that time? And well, if the very, very frum would say it's about the miracle, and perhaps the more secular would say no, it's about sovereignty. But you're actually both right. It's actually yes and yes. They're both correct. For example, if you take a look at Al-Hanisim does not talk about the miracle at all. It's entirely about the reestablishment of Jewish hegemony in Eretz Yisrael. It's about reestablishing a Jewish-controlled government, the ability to determine our own affairs. That's what we celebrate on Chanukah. At the same time, when you take a look at how the Talmud talks about Chanukah, it's entirely about the miracle of the oil. They're both true. They're both correct. We celebrate both of them. Let's take this a step further, perhaps. There's a very famous comment I was looking at this past Shabbos from the Ramban, Nachmanides, in his commentary to the Torah. And he suggests the reason why the Chashmonaim, the Hasmonean house, ultimately was exterminated was the reason why, because it was a punishment for them taking the reins of civil authority. They became the king. They became the lords. They became the leaders. They weren't the religious leaders. They were the secular leaders. So why is that a problem? What is the issue? Why is it that a Kohen should, or the Kohen Gadol, at least in their case specifically, should not be the ruler for the Jewish people? So let's perhaps suggest that there's something there's something of a dichotomy here. Priests are entrusted to nurture and cultivate the spiritual. Kohanim are religious functionaries. They're the guardians of the temple. They're the teachers. They're the halachic judges, at least in the initial generations. So in that regard, they have to reserve a certain amount of neutrality. They have to exist within a spiritual ivory tower. They have to remain pristine. The values of the Torah can never be impugned or be marred. They have to always remain in that pure, idealized form. And that's what the Kohen comes to represent. But civil leaders exist within the world of war and politics. The political arena is the arena of egos, power, political deals and compromises. The battlefield is a world of brutality. It's a world of violence. It's a place of killing. And certainly the war front and the election trail do have a moral code, but it's a moral code that has been stripped of its ideal circumstances and applied to a non-ideal situation. The messy human reality of power and politics. Sometimes we have to compromise in order to ensure the safety and the well-being of our citizens. It's not necessarily appropriate that the guardians of the law and the purveyors of God's truth take that role and become those sometimes necessarily brutal leaders that we occasionally need to have. It's not necessarily the place for the Kohen to operate. And we actually do see that within our own reality that, people sort of fall within these camps. Some people seize the mantle of the king, while other people seize the mantle of the priest. So you think they eschew the compromises that people in power have to make. They view the military as corrosive to Torah life. They reject the intellectual challenges of academia. Is all about the pristine, pure vial of oil and how that has to be preserved and perpetuated. It's a non-worldly purity. And since the clash between the ideal and the real is so unbridgeable, they sometimes have to create or construct something of an idealized world. Nation building is not what they do. The Mashiach will come as an agent from God. The Beis Hamikdash will descend from heaven. People will return through divine intervention. They utilize miracles to remove the intractable problems of our contemporary Jewish life. They essentially exist in the world of the pristine and the pure. Well, and the truth is, you can even find secular analogs in liberal circles as well. Especially with regards to Israel. We find that there's an incredible discomfort with the violence and the compromises that are ultimately involved in wielding power and keeping your citizens safe. There's a yearning for an existence in which we're never morally compromised. But at the same time, you also have people who fall on the other end. The majority of Israelis will tell you that whereas they have no ill will towards Gaza and the Gazans, if Hamas fires missiles at their homes, they have to fire back, regardless of the death toll that will be experienced on the other side. It's impossible to stand on the sidelines. The business of statehold and national defense are inherently mired in complicated moral decisions. And in essence, that's the challenge. So you have on one hand the civil leadership that has to be brutal sometimes, has to make compromises, perhaps be called upon to make immoral decisions. And you have those who completely remove themselves from any of those challenges and exist in the world where there are no moral compromises. So where do we stand? Most of us are neither one of these extremes. We mark both the miracle and the war. how do we celebrate Judaism's high values and at the same time rejoice at sovereignty if there is this inherent contradiction in these two drives, these two imperatives? So we have to come back to the notion of the dialectic. We have two poles, we have two extremes. They're both valuable and they're both important, and at the same time, they're mutually abrasive and perhaps even incompatible. We have to live a lifestyle that not doesn't choose to synthesize both of them or to synthesize both of them, but we have to sort of oscillate back and forth. We have to hold both realities in our hands. On one hand, we have to understand and comprehend and try to aspire to live up to the incredible goals, the incredible values that Judaism has, but at the same time sort of being mindful of the necessity that real life has and our obligations to each other and our obligations that our politicians have for us. So that perhaps is the message of Chanukah as well, where there's no way to completely meld these two worlds. They are completely incompatible, but we have to sort of walk this tightrope where we balance both of these drives as equally valid and as equally important, where we celebrate Jewish sovereignty and at the same time we celebrate the miracle of the oil. All right, that's idea number 5. Idea number 6. The jar of oil inside you. So the Sfas Emes asks the question. This is the Ger Rebbe. The Ger Rebbe asked the question, what is the metaphor of the jar of oil? What does that come to represent? And this is what he says. He says that within the Jewish people as a whole, there is a nekuda, there's a point, there's a nucleus of holiness that endures even when the surrounding world is dark. And within the individual as well, there's a kernel of holiness, there's a kernel of something that is pure, something that's incorruptible, something that's untouchable. There's a divine spark that remains within every single Jew. And the message of Chanukah is perhaps to find that inner kernel, to foster that small amount of oil, that pure holiness, to ignite it, allow it to grow, to allow it to expand and inspire our entire lives and our entire communities. But that is idea number 6. Idea number 7, renew the routine. So by this time, it's the 7th night of Chanukah, we've had a full week. So that means every single day of the week has had Chanukah. So we've gone through the entire cycle. What do we take away? What's the message? What's the importance here? And again, I turn back to the Sfas Emes, I turn back to the Ger Rebbe. He actually sort of misquotes a statement found in the Gemara. I don't think I included it here in the handout, but the statement reads as follows. When do you light the Chanukah candles? Mitzvasa mishatishka hachama ad shetichlor haregel min hashuk. You light the candle from sundown until the time that people have finished returning home after work. But he misquotes it slightly and takes it out of its obvious meaning. And he states that Chanukah is when the sun sets in our lives, when we feel dark. We have to, at that point, end the hergel, end our routinized Judaism, and refresh, rekindle, and renew. Similar idea I've spoken about on some of the other days. All right. Now, the final idea, day 8. The dedication of the Mishkan, and every person plays a role. So as I mentioned earlier a few times, we read throughout Chanukah every single morning as part of the Kriyas HaTorah, we read about the inaugural offerings made by the tribal leaders when the Mishkan, when the sanctuary used in the desert first started operation. But the truth is, if we were to look throughout the Torah, it's repeated 3 times. The story of the inauguration is repeated 3 times, and each time it brings a different participant. There are different people doing different things, but it's all describing the same events. In Sefer Shemos, in the book of Exodus, we read about Moshe, what he was doing, and the offerings that he was making, and all the instructions that he gave. In Sefer Vayikra, in Leviticus, we read about the offerings that the priests offered on over the course of its inauguration. And in Sefer Bamidbar, which is what we read throughout the course of Chanukah, we read about the Nesiim, the chieftains, the tribal leaders, and what they did at the time of the inauguration of the Mishkan. So what does this teach us? Well, I think what it teaches us is that we all have the ability to connect to what is sacred. We all have access to the conduit by which God speaks to us. One does not have to be a prophet. One does not have to be a high priest. every single individual, regarding of their station in society and in life, has the ability to connect with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Each group, each tribe, in all their differences and uniqueness, have the ability to express themselves and to give something and to connect with Hashem in their own individualized way. The Nisim brought offerings of their own volition, and so too we can offer whatever it is that we have to offer. For some people, it'll be their educational ability. For other people, it'll be the ability to entertain. Whatever it is, we can all give back. We can all aspire. We can all connect with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And perhaps the message here is that we all have a place. We all have a role that we can play, and it is incumbent upon us to find that method by which we can contribute to Judaism. And at the same time, by doing so, we make Judaism more meaningful and more significant to us. With that, I conclude the class, and I am open now to questions, comments, or rebuttals. And I will stop the sharing and open the door of opportunity. If anyone has a question, please feel free to ask.